Hello and welcome again to Control F, the NSI Cyber and Tech Centers podcast. This season, we're bringing you a series of sessions from one of the nation's leading cyber events, the National Cyber Innovation Forum. My name is Andrew McClure, the president of the National Cyber Innovation Forum. In this episode, we dive into a conversation with the Vice President of Government Affairs at ForeScout, Alison King, the Associate Director of the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, Clayton Romans of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and Tatyana Bolton, the Executive Director of the OT Cyber Coalition and the Strategic Cybersecurity Coalition. Stay tuned for a conversation about how public-private partnerships are strengthening information and operational technology security, improving threat information sharing, and aligning policy and industry action to defend the systems that underpin national security, economic stability, in our digital world. So for our next panel, working with industry, we have Clayton Romans, Tatyana Bolton, and Alison King. Clayton Romans is the Associate Director of the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, which is a public-private partnership, which we were talking about in the previous session out of CISA. Tatyana Bolton is the Executive Director for the OT Cyber Coalition and the Strategic Cybersecurity Coalition, and of course, this panel is moderated by Alison King of ForeScout. Allie, please take it from here.
Thank you so much. Sorry. I think you can hear me now. All right, perfect. Well, good morning, everyone. Delighted to be here with you and two folks that I know very well, fireside chat, as well around working with industry. And so the way that I like to do fireside chats is just to pretend that you're not here, and it's just us just catching up, being very candid about where we see opportunity, where we see challenges. But obviously, I'm going to turn things over to Tatyana Bolton, who's the OTCC Director. So for folks that don't know that acronym, that's the OT Cyber Coalition. So what do you think, Tatyana? Where's your head at?
Well, thanks, Allie. Allie's a good friend, and we work together all the time. And so I think you hear very much what I hear all the time, which is that on the industry side, we're still working to get clarity. We're wanting to have a seat at the table. I think this administration has done actually a really great job, especially ONCD and CISA, engaging with industry, asking for feedback, engaging in us in conversation. But I think there's a number of different opportunities for improvement. And a lot of that comes from the actual operational collaboration that's necessary to help protect our networks and systems. Obviously, from the OTCC side, I think it's particularly true for critical infrastructure and OT. I think that portion of network security, collaboration, investment, and resources has really been missing. And I think, even I think Nick would agree with this because we've spoken with him about this before, is that, CISA has probably less resources on that side and would like more. And I know of the hiring that you guys are doing, you're doing more on that side. And we'd love to see that because we've got a lot of expertise and we do a lot of work providing policy recommendations and things like that on the industry side. But obviously we need a partner that is staffed and has the capacity to engage with us on the government side.
So Clayton, let's assume that you're given all the resources in the world. So this isn't a resourcing issue. You have all the resources, you have all the authorities. Given that you've been with CISA for many years and you have perspective now, if you could go back in time, what would you tell yourself with the lessons learned and just the challenges that we are facing now in this, potentially post-mythos world where LLMs are being weaponized? What would you tell the folks that are on your team, and how would you look to move forward from here?
It's a great question, and thank you, and good morning. I would say I've been with CISA so long that I've turned into the seal behind us, which is fantastic. I couldn't agree more with the sort of fundamental premise that we're discussing and what Tatyana laid out in terms of how we need to leverage partnerships together to tackle these challenges. And the time that I've been at CISA, I've been in many roles, and most recently leading the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative in JCDC. And our whole business model is figuring out how we bring the right capabilities and right expertise across the public and private sector into this space. When I look back over the past several years since we stood up, I think the lessons we've learned have been really important and have been shaped by 1,000 different operational experiences. The geopolitical tensions that we're all tracking, a number of different adversary campaigns across all of our infrastructure sectors, targeting of the federal civilian executive branch, etc. And I think we got the right authorities, even if we didn't have King for a day additional authorities. We have some really important and unique authorities that allow us to do incredible work. But the lessons we've learned is we need to do it faster, we need to tighten it up, we need to figure out who are the right partners, and we need to figure out what capabilities those partners bring to this fight. The most important group, I think, is industry. Whether it's in critical infrastructure or broadly across the IT sector, how do we leverage the capabilities and operational insight and visibility that industry has and pair it with the insights that we have directly from CISA, for example, the insights that we're seeing from our intelligence community partners, the expertise across sector risk management agencies. We talk a lot about how cybersecurity is a team sport, but to build a successful team, you really need to know what players you have, which ones you need on the court at any given time, and sort of what their skill set is. And I would say, if I could go back and do this work, how do we do it faster? How do we leverage what we have even more effectively? I think we're on the right trajectory. As Nick mentioned a few minutes ago, the National Cybersecurity Strategy lays out mission objectives and outcomes that we have been focused on at CISA that predates the strategy itself and really tightens up and focuses us on exactly where we think we can make an impact. So I'm excited about how we are moving forward, but sort of learning some of those lessons from our initial cyber defense plans, from the advisories we've published, and the work that we've done in that space.
Wonderful. So also, to pull this thread a little bit as well, within the National Cyber Strategy, there's discussion around unleashing the private sector, which I love. So I'm like, what exactly does that mean? And they don't really tell you. And I know that it's not letters of marque. I know it's not hackback, but is it maybe, a little limited liability here, there, and everywhere? Because that is what's preventing a lot of folks within the private sector to invest more in national security and to be those tools and capabilities that we need because we share the entire risk portfolio. So what do you think about CISA 2015? Is that just the beginning? Do you, foresee there being more of an appetite to open that aperture a little bit more and bring in the private sector further along?
I do, and I would say, CISA 2015 is foundational and fundamental to our success. We have several authorities that says that it is central and critical to the work that we not only do with industry, with partners like you guys, but also that the industry does with each other. So for this whole ecosystem to work, it's a really important authority. And I would say, building on that authority and a couple of other authorities that we have, one way for us, it's true, there's so many opportunities for how we could work better across the public and private sector. I think for us, it's really also sharpening up how do we bring the private sector into the plans and playbooks that we have built. So, originally, before we sort of started thinking through this joint cyber planning model, we would start from a government perspective and lay out the problem and figure out what the government solution is, and then bring in the private sector. And sort of how do we do that hand in hand from the beginning? And not only because it works better, it synchronizes us faster, but also because we rely on the insight from critical infrastructure owners and operators and private sector companies to really understand the threat landscape and figure out what we're going to do about it.
I would double down on that. I think that's incredibly important, starting kind of working hand in hand the whole process, because we've seen things like CISA, for example, the rule when it came out, 435 pages, and industry was generally, I think, not pleased. And so, I think that caused additional work on your end and a delay in the release of this very critical regulation and rule. And so, I think that's one piece. The other thing that, and no hit on you, but I do think, to your point on speed and getting information out, and what I was saying before around operational collaboration. There are still things that are coming out, like the intel that's sometimes released to industry, I think is still a little, it is not exactly bidirectional. So I think what we're seeing is like, sometimes, this happened when I was at Google, we got a release from GCDC, this thing was like 2 years old, and Google gets it, and they're like, what are we supposed to do with that? Right? Like, that's not the kind of intel that organizations like Google need, and I think that goes to like Nick's point about we have to work with the critical entities. Maybe it's a new list that you guys are developing, but those organizations definitely need to have a different kind of relationship with CISA, because, GCDC can have engagements with private sector, but if it is a large group that's like hundreds of people, I don't think they're going to share that much information with each other. I think we've seen that the type of information that's shared in those types of environments isn't actually the kind of information we need them to share. And so I am curious too about, I'm not a moderator, but I am curious what, you guys are doing to kind of improve that process where there's actually true relationships established and that there's possibly a tiering for JCDC where, there's a lot more trust established between these groups to enable more sharing. Because I think at this point, that is one of the other biggest issues.
Totally agree. And I would say in this fireside chat, we let everybody drive. I love it. You touched on two things, Tatyana. One strategic from my perspective, and one is tactical. Strategically, you hit the nail on the head. It is, we want to be working with the closest and most capable partners to take action at scale to protect everybody else. All the owners and operators, the American public, et cetera. So how do we do that best? And when we first, our initial partnership model really focused on who are the internet backbone companies across the world, many of which are largely concentrated here in the United States. How do we bring them to the table, and how do we create the premier league of cybersecurity collaboration? What we found very quickly is there's more than just 12 companies that can make an impact here. So how do we bring in, there's lots of players in this ecosystem, including researchers. We talked about open source a little bit earlier. Lots of different companies, different international counterparts, other parts of the state and local ecosystem that can really contribute to the space. But you quickly get from a small table to a conference center this large full of partners in a Slack channel. And that's not really conducive to the sort of tipping and queuing and close operational work we want to do. So pragmatically, one thing we've learned is we've got to identify companies and partners who have similar capabilities, who are willing to share with each other, bring them together with CISA's convening authority, and then build plans to take action. So whether it is focused on OT or different subsets of OT capabilities, it could be focused on identity, it could be focused on DDoS prevention, sort of all of the different sorts of cybersecurity problems that we've seen. How do we build partnership work around those specific and more tightly scoped capabilities? And then I would just say secondarily, I think it's a really good point in terms of how do we want to be useful to computer network defenders across the board, including really large companies like Google and critical infrastructure out in Kansas. And one way to do that is working with the providers of a lot of that infrastructure. So we've learned lessons over the past several years to make information more useful, to make sure that it's timely, to make sure that it's tied to actionable intelligence, bringing in companies earlier as we develop this guidance. So before we put out detection methodologies, or before we put out mitigations for how a vulnerability should be addressed, we'll work with those vendors on the front end. I think the value proposition is that we bring the right expertise to the table to make sure that we have a singular voice across the community, telling owners and operators what actions to take. And then we bring in expertise from across our partnerships in the US government and the international community to have a unified voice.
If I can jump in on that really quickly, I think that unified voice, right, the thing that the industry's been asking for a long time, one door to walk through, one message to hear, I think that, to be honest, is still really not there. I think industry hears any number of different guidances from CISA to, nonprofits to like CISA, DOE, and other agencies across the board. I think everyone is trying to do their best. I think it's just not necessarily coordinated within the government to the level that I think industry wants to see. And there's certainly not one door that you go in to talk to the government. That's still very much not there. And then, obviously the thing I hear very often from all of my member companies is the harmonization regulations. Still a significant burden, significant issues. Or CI obviously was trying to fix at least one piece of that for incident reporting. Again, how 5 years out, we still don't have that, or how many years it was. I think those are still a significant issue.
And what I would like to kind of jump on too around sort of say, especially with that final rule still pending, I know it's being worked on. I do think that will provide a lot of insight within the JCTC structure that we discussed. What I do think is interesting is that when that was actually passed by Congress, I believe it was about almost 4 years ago, it was an appropriations bill, but neither here nor there, again, that was also a response from the Hill saying, what happened with the Colonial Pipeline, we were unhappy, we need to strengthen CISA as the national coordinator, so here you go, make sure you work with industry so this is palatable since they are operational partners there. What I think is going to be super interesting is that when that was all created, there was also a requirement for DHS to put together a report, because across the federal executive branch, and this is before Chevron deference was struck down by the Supreme Court, rulemaking was going on a lot. Even the SEC, they were like a little Leroy Jenkins about their incident reporting to protect investors. Appreciate that, but again, to Tatyana's point, there was different pieces. And so if you were in the private sector, yes, you've got adversaries threatening your business, but you also have regulatory risks that you have to be mindful about too. And so instead of finding more tools, hiring more folks who can do this important work, you're hiring lawyers. And so it's just very interesting. In the United States we have lawyers, in China they have engineers, in Europe they've got regulators. And so we just kind of have to figure out how we navigate national security as a business, where a lot of us sit and reside. So I am grateful for everybody who's at CISA. We, being CISA alums here, understand how critical that agency is. The work is absolutely necessary. I think that once we do have that rule, and I know that the DHS longest shutdown ×2 does not help anything here, so I want to be gracious towards everybody that's there, but let's assume, this is how we could be, this is part of the conversation, that we do have a rule, and that industry says, thank you for taking our comments, we can work with this. And things are running smoothly, you're able to maybe be the traffic cop from an intake form perspective. So then again, that regulatory burden, which I think is a symptom of a bigger problem, which is you can't aggregate all of this in one place to have a common OD so you can coordinate across government. Let's assume all that works. What does your day look like when you wake up and you walk into the building under those conditions?
Leroy Jenkins,
yeah.
I might say. As a repentant lawyer, I won't stand up for the legal community, but as a current CISA diehard, I'd say, you guys are touching on two really important issues for us that we're working through. On CIRCIA, we are delayed. The funding lapses didn't make us go faster. I would say what's most important, though, is that we get it right. And so we are committed to working with industry to make sure this rule is scoped appropriately and then implemented appropriately. What's really critical for the rule to be effective once it's implemented is that we have the technology in place, which we have been able to continue working on at CISA. We've made a lot of progress there. How do we actually take the data that industry is sharing with us, use it internal to our agency, and then the same federated partnership model, leverage the capabilities of the right partners that can take action? And one other thing sort of to marry two of the points together, something you said, Tatyana, whether or not it's a company reporting through CIRCIA an incident, or whether or not it's a collaboratively provided tip or insight to us, we still need to figure out how to synchronize that data effectively, and we need to figure out who takes what action. We're not 100% there yet. I think CIRCIA is a really important step in the right direction once we implement the rule, but it's going to be one of many tools in our toolbox. And I think it enables companies also to work through some of the legal complexities that frankly exist. I joke about lawyers, but lawyers are critical because every time we engage on an important incident, one of the first calls we're having is with the legal teams. And I think part of it, it's often an educational experience to say, we have these authorities. There is the opportunity to collaborate here more than what may seem risk-friendly at first glance. And figuring out how to communicate that message, to help everybody understand what the rule means, to understand the power of working with CISA and through CISA the rest of the government in this collaborative way, I think is something we need to do before a crisis. Nick mentioned a little bit earlier how we're working to identify and prioritize the most critical infrastructure across the U.S., working with the Department of War and other government agencies. That's the same approach we want to take even as we're responding to incidents. And CISA, when we implement the rule, will help with that.
So once upon a time, there was a list called Section 9. I'm not really savvy on what we're calling it now. And then within that list, there has been for years, and I have to give credit to Tom Fanning, previous chairman and CEO of Southern Company, where he's like, yes, I understand the Section 9 piece, but we really got to get to the asset level. And once we are able to understand what those assets are, I think that dovetails back into the continuity of the economy plan. I know last administration, there was a document that was created. I'm not sure where the Trump administration sits with it, but putting politics aside and only focusing on policy, if you were able to have that list, understand those assets, where would you want to focus your teams? And how could companies that are members of like the OT Cyber Coalition, which Tatyana represents, but the broader ecosystem look to play a role?
I would want to do two things, and both things that we have underway, but I would want to be able to move even faster and achieve success. One is sort of how do we help owners and operators, regardless of the prioritization, understand their assets. And working with OT companies and partners, including Tatyana, we put out guidance last year, and it really reflects the model we've tried to build. This is not compulsory, this is voluntary guidance, it was developed voluntarily, but it's really good guidance, and it helps us when we are engaging, whether it's during an incident or in advance to understand the risk picture, for owners and operators to be able to come to the table and actually take action with us. So I'd say continuing to push out the sort of technical specifications and standards that we've developed. I think the second part of it is, being able to focus on the right infrastructure at the right time with the right partners. So, right now we're really cutting across all the lifeline sectors as we go out to owners and operators, but we're doing it in really close partnership with the sector risk management agencies that manage the broader risk for the whole sector, including non-cyber impacts. And it's fantastic because it requires sort of the full might of the U.S. government in a coordinated way to actually drive action in this space. And I think, a long way of saying the planning effort that we have underway now and the CI Fortify guidance that we are talking about, I think is the right approach. We just have to continue to move forward and faster.
So the last question I have, and then I'll turn it over to y'all for closing thoughts, is while, the mythos moment that we are living in right now, or, ChatGPT 5.5, whatever flavor of this is coming towards us, the potential weaponized LLM, you have in one hand. On the other hand, you have quantum. And they're both, as I like to kind of phrase it, they're a margin call or a tech debt, but they also challenge our assumptions around time in our architecture. Understanding that you have these two things that we have to manage. What are your thoughts that you want to leave the audience, both from industry and the government? I'll start with industry.
So we're actually hosting an AI and Mythos in OT conversation to kind of get at some of this stuff, challenge those assumptions, discuss what the assumptions are, and come up with policy recommendations. The first thing I'll say is that that came up in our first meeting is that the speed challenges assumptions around this patch first, approach to how we do security right now. Can we patch our way to security? And I think in OT we've been finding, generally speaking, that's not the answer. Microsegmentation and remote secure remote access is more successful because there is in many cases there is no patching on the OT side. How we do CDSS scores If you can chain a bunch of low, consequence vulnerabilities together, is that low consequence anymore? And then also thinking through things like assessment cadence. If the models are coming out at a pace of like every 3 to 6 months, can you have a yearly assessment that gives you any credible information? So I think it's important for us to think through all of that. And to your point about speed, I think one thing industry doesn't want to hear is just do it faster, right? Like just faster, guys, faster. I mean, yes, AI can help with that on the defensive side as it can on the offensive side. But when you're talking about, critical infrastructure, 95% of them are under-resourced, right? So how are they going to do that? Even in the energy space, we hear from energy companies and those organizations that say, we're rate constrained. We can't just, spend a bunch more money. And this doesn't affect just like, rural Idaho or, whatever random place that has no national security impact. We're talking about places that support bases. We're talking about, things that are critical to the functioning of the United States economy.
Amen to that. And I would say it should be less about being faster and more about being smarter, especially as we gain new capabilities. So from my perspective, how do we, as we learn more about what is very exciting technology, how do we understand it, both from a government perspective and from a user perspective? And then how do we help shape and drive the conversation for the best deployment that is the most secure for the most people and keeps critical infrastructure safe? I think that as we've entered into these conversations and as we prepare for the significant work that is going to continue to be underway, we're thinking through how do we prioritize patching better? How do we actually manage the vulnerability ecosystem under our current construct even more effectively? And we have the groundwork laid there to do that. But also, let's be creative. The construct that we've built at CISA to work with the private sector, this is one of the main reasons for it. So as we've been meeting with counterparts in industry who are leading the development of these technologies, sort of what are we not thinking about? We can't just rely on the current existing constructs that we have in place. So what are we looking towards the future to build to make sure that we're staying at the pace of technology? And to give one example of laying the foundation for this, we brought together all of the leading AI companies and our close IT sector partners about a year and a half ago, about 2 years ago, I think, to build a playbook for how we define AI security incidents and how we manage them in partnership with the FBI, in partnership with the NSA, in partnership with some of our international counterparts like the United Kingdom and Australia and Canada. That was a first of its kind sort of collaboration approach for a lot of companies that hadn't yet worked with the US government. We built that construct so we can do work now when these types of capabilities come out. So we have a good pathway.
That's great. Thank you so much for your time today. We continue to look forward to working with you, and I'll see you in the back room.
Yeah. Thank you.
That's a wrap for today's episode. Thanks to Hannah Haynes, Keelan Wolf, Claude Jennings, and the entire NSI CTC team in helping us produce today's episode. Be on the lookout every Monday and Wednesday for more sessions from the National Cyber Innovation Forum. If you like what you heard, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe. Thanks again.